Karen McNeil is a historian based in Auckland. She has done research on gender and feminism, particularly related to the architectural profession. She teaches at various Bay Area colleges and universities, and she is a few paragraphs away from submitting her book manuscript to her publisher. So we are very pleased to have her here with us. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Good morning. So I see a couple of familiar faces, but mostly new ones. So thank you very much for spending your Saturday morning with me and UC Extension, and thank you to Ray for inviting me to speak at UC Extension. Today I'm going to talk about Julia Morgan, insights into her genius and legacy. And I will try not to go too long, 45 minutes at most, and then I am happy to answer whatever questions you have directly related to the talk or whatever other questions you might have about Julia Morgan and her career. So first, I don't want to assume that anybody necessarily knows anything about Julia Morgan, so a basic biography of her. She was born in San Francisco in 1872 and raised in Auckland. And in 1890, she entered the University of California at Berkeley and graduated in 1894 with a degree in civil engineering, and she was one of the first women to earn that degree. 2 years later, she set sail for Paris, hoping that she would be able to study at the École des Beaux-Arts, but she wasn't sure yet if they would be accepting women students. When she arrived, she learned that a union of women artists had successfully lobbied the faculty to allow women to take courses with the promise that they'd be able to apply for the degree programs a year later. So Julia Morgan studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. In 1898, she became the first woman admitted to the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts. And in 1902, she was the first woman to earn a degree in architecture from the École des Beaux-Arts. Upon returning to California, she worked for John Galen Howard at the University of California. And in 1904, she became the first woman to get her architectural license in the state of California and open an office in San Francisco. Over the next almost half century, she designed over around 700 buildings. She's most famous for Hearst Castle, but she designed dozens and dozens of women's clubs, commercial establishments, warehouses, hundreds of houses, and churches, and just about every kind of architectural type that you can think of. In 1929, the University of California awarded Julia Morgan an honorary Doctor of Laws degree. Mills College offered her an honorary Doctor of Laws, but she was too busy to accept it. And in 1940, the Women's Board of the Golden Gate International Exposition named Julia Morgan one of the 10 most influential women in California. So as I said, in 1898, Julia Morgan became the first woman admitted to the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts. It was quite an ordeal, and you can ask me about it. But we'll just move on to her training. So what was the philosophy of the École des Beaux-Arts? How was she trained? Interestingly, the École curriculum was changing significantly in the 1890s. It was incorporating math and science much more into its curriculum and requirements, particularly in the wake of the United States and their growing skyscrapers. So steel construction was very important, and reinforced concrete construction was very important. So they were heading towards a much more modern way of building. But still, the core of their aesthetics was steeped in classicism. So here you see Julia Morgan's 4 sketches of columns from the Greek and Roman periods. Very much a classicist education. And classicism and medieval architecture. Her architectural history courses actually covered most types of world architecture: South American, Mexico, Asian cultures, various styles from Europe, but really it's Northern European medieval architecture and classicism that dominated the aesthetics and also public monumental projects. Julie Morgan, she fulfilled her assignments. She once designed a prison based on this program that the École des Beaux-Arts wanted. But quite frankly, she was not sold on their public, formal, monumental projects that really had very little bearing on everyday life. So she was always critical of the École curriculum. And her mentor, Francois Bernard Chasmiche, he commented that she likes to mix styles like most Americans did. And so here you see an entryway with a griffin that really kind of combines medieval and classical, and it's a real hodgepodge. I believe she won some points on this one, so the École wasn't closed-minded to mixing up the styles. But Julie Morgan was very open to mixing up styles. When she returned to California in 1902, Julie Morgan worked for John Galen Howard, who was the architect in charge of designing and implementing the brand new Beaux-Arts style campus at the University of California, which Phoebe Hearst had underwritten a couple of years before. And Julie Morgan worked on the Greek theater. She basically designed the thing. She's well known to have saved the university from embarrassment when it wasn't completed. When Teddy Roosevelt came to speak in the spring of 1903, she used some fancy drapery to make it okay for a public event. But John Galen Howard, he was pretty much out of town the whole time that this project was being constructed. And Victoria Brown, who's the mother of Arthur Brown Jr., who designed San Francisco City Hall, she commented that Julie Morgan designed the whole thing, and everybody knows she did. But, of course, she didn't get credit for that. Everybody in the inner circle knew, but there was no public credit for Julie Morgan. A common practice, actually, at the time for lead architects just to take sole credit. But it did make Julie Morgan well aware of the fact that she wouldn't be getting full credit for other people's work. She would never be recognized like she wanted to be if she stayed in John Galen Howard's practice or anybody else's. But again, here, this is probably the most literal execution of a Beaux-Arts style project that Julie Morgan ever worked on. It is a recreation, as closely as possible, of an amphitheater in Epidaurus, Greece, which the amphitheater had recently been uncovered by archaeologists. In her own private practice, perhaps the Oakland YWCA most closely follows Beaux-Arts principles. The exterior, from the exterior anyway, the building looks much like the Medici Palazzo in Florence. And with its tripartite construction, the rusticated base, the arcaded front, it does inverse the level of rustication on the second and third parts. The Medici Palace goes from very rusticated on the bottom to somewhat rusticated in the middle and then smooth on top. So Morgan elongated the central section and smoothed it out with just stucco, and then created a more rusticated feel to the top section by having glazed terracotta tile and decorative elements there. And then there's glazed terracotta around the windows too. There's no doubt that the interior very much follows the Santa Maria della Pace church in Rome. This is an image from the archives at San Luis Obispo. You can see the resemblance, the arcading, the columns, the whole court plan. No doubt about that. And you can go through many, many Morgan projects and find direct references to historical precedent. You definitely can. And she mixed and matched things, and Hearst Castle is the best example of that. You can find a basilica element here, a mission element there, cathedral element somewhere else. So that is one approach that Julie Morgan had based on her Beaux-Arts education. The Campanile at Mills College is arguably the most important structure that Julie Morgan ever designed. And at this point, I could pretty much write a book just about the campanile, so you have to trust me when I say it's possibly one of the most important structure that she ever designed. You can see here that Julia Morgan, again, looked to historic precedent in her design, but not a classical precedent. So supposedly the campanile is based on the Palamission Bell Tower in the San Diego area. But you could look, what's more important is not the specific bell tower that she was looking at, but that she didn't do a more Italianate bell tower that was a long, tall, rectangular shaft with the carillon at the top and basically hidden. Because this design, the function was manifolded. Like I said, I could write a book. But what Morgan had to achieve in this design, among other things, was one, she chose the California mission style because Mills College at the time was suffering. Mills College dated to 1852. It went back to the gold rush days, but from the 1890s onward, coeducation was gaining. Mills College was all women. And Berkeley and Stanford were offering free educations to women with much more rigorous curricula. So Mills College was staking a claim in the history of California by adopting the mission style. So that's one reason why it's important that Morgan chose the mission style. But there was something else. The bells were a gift of David Hughes, and the tower itself was the gift of Francis Marion Smith, who developed the key root system, among other things. So the monument to this gift had to celebrate both donors equally. Therefore, this type of campanile, this style, was more effective than a more Italianate style, which was probably more popular at the time, generally speaking. This is the first freestanding bell tower on any college campus in the United States. But you can see by having the narrow building or the thin building with all the openings for the bells, showing clearly that Morgan celebrated David Hughes' gift of the bells, the award-winning bells that first appeared at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, and the tower itself. So function, I've kind of mentioned function a few times. That is one of the key elements to Morgan, understanding Morgan and design. And again, a different historical precedent. This one's very regional. Okay, it's regionally specific. But by far the most popular regional style when Julia Morgan was starting out her career, and for the first 15 years or so, was the Bay tradition, which Lewis Mumford coined the term for in the late 1940s. Asilomar here has the greatest collection of any single collection of Bay tradition buildings. Asilomar began as a conference center for the YWCA. It was the first conference center in the nation for the YWCA. And you can see in the Bay tradition that there's an emphasis on the local, on site and local materials. So its local river stone is part of the cladding, and then unpainted brown shingles, and almost no applied decoration. Instead of having man's art imposed on the landscape, the buildings emerge from the landscape and rest with it. And this is really noticeable if you're at the beach at Asilomar and you look back. To the right, to the south, is a relatively new condominium complex. And then there's Asilomar to the left. And the condominium complex are these black buildings that stand up, and they're all about having property on the beach. And Asilomar, again, is very much about spending time with nature and being communal and the like. So also exposed structural elements double as decorative features, as you can see in the trusses of the Phoebe Hearst Assembly Hall. The Bay tradition also was very popular in houses. Julia Morgan designed hundreds of houses, particularly during the first decade, first 13 or so years of her house. And again, you can see that you have carefully cultivated wild gardens decorating the house rather than paint and decoration, applied decoration. Again, they blend into the landscape. And just a few examples of them. They all carry the same principle. This one, it was such a popular style. This one was a Victorian house that was turned into a Bay tradition style. Okay. Ironically, the Bay tradition style emerged at the same time as an environmental movement and a love for camping and Californians' newfound love for their natural environment, which they had just destroyed during the previous half-decade through mining and other things. So there was very much like, we love nature, and so we're going to blend into it and live with it and have our, our open terraces that were sleeping porches and things. But ironically, the popularity of this style hastened deforestation. So it became too expensive after about a decade or a little bit more. But that doesn't mean that many of the principles were lost. Here you have a house, a 1915 house, for Ralph and Oma Eldsey, and it's stucco. It's more Mediterranean in style. But the rocks in the front there, they were part of the site. So Julia Morgan designed around the rocks and again tried to have the building emerge from them and exist with it. And instead of having brown shingles to capture the natural elements, there are planter boxes instead. But you still don't have gingerbread cuttings or anything like that, or paint. And very indicative of a Julia Morgan house, this house is very sensitive to location. It's in the East Bay Hills, in the Berkeley Hills, and it has two porches that were originally sleeping porches. Apparently one has been enclosed, and it's a third bedroom, and it makes for a really awkward house now. But at the time, it was an open sleeping porch. One faces the East Bay Hills, and one has panoramic views of the bay. So Julia Morgan really keyed in on location. Julia Morgan is very much known as a client's architect. And sometimes this is used as against her, but I find that to be one of the most significant things about her. As I mentioned, she designed hundreds of houses in a short period of time. And she once told one of her employees that she couldn't remember one house from the next. But her clients had a very different experience. Elizabeth Watt, she remembered sitting down with Julia Morgan in 1910 or so at the height of this housing craze. And when she sat down with Julia Morgan, it was as if you were the most important thing in Julia Morgan's world. And she carried this through all of her relationships with all of her clients. When she left, she might have forgotten her client when she was done with the project, but they were left with this feeling of just having a person there for them, to understand them, to cater to their needs, to create a building that functioned for them in everyday use and in symbolic and aesthetic uses. So sometimes you'd have quirky results. This is the interior plan of the Eldsey house. And Ralph Eldsey did not want any single room in his house to have 4 square corners. So you have an odd shape to the house. Okay? Somehow that 4th corner is always broken. Or you have the James Lombard house, which James Lombard wanted a house that looked like a painting of a country house in Croydon, which is kind of funny to me if you've ever visited Croydon in the southern edges of London. It's anything but sort of a country paradise. But anyway, at the time it was. And so Julia Morgan had to work from the outside in. She had to fit the plan to the windows on the painting of the house in England. And this was the opposite way that she usually worked. She usually went from the inside out, went from function to style. But, clients are clients, and she gave clients what they wanted. Sometimes the results could be far more significant. So here you have the first design for the King's Daughters Home for Incurables in Oakland, which is at 39th and Broadway and is now the psychiatric building for Kaiser. And you can see it's a massive 3-story building with a very heavily ornamented portico and some terraces on either side. You'll note that it was published on April 7th, 1906. 11 days later, this was not a practical design. The San Francisco earthquake and fires had shown that brick was not a very good structural material in an earthquake. It wasn't flexible enough, and this was supposed to be brick, so brick wasn't a very good idea. The rebuilding of San Francisco made the cost of building supplies skyrocket. So the cost of a massive building like this was far too much for a nonprofit charitable women's organization like the King's Daughters Home for Incurables, which have had to seek donations for their project. So it was completely impractical. But they needed a new building because the mansion that they had been using was not occupiable anymore. It was ruined by the earthquake. So Julia Morgan came up with an alternative design within about a year. And now she created a multi-building hospital. All of the buildings are 2 to 3 stories tall, wood frame buildings with brick cladding and terracotta decorations around entryways and in friezes, and all organized around an exterior courtyard. Now, this was actually a far more modern hospital design. Hospitals at the time were going into more lower-level multi-building facilities to create more natural light, to have more ventilation, to be able to separate germs more easily. So that was good. You know, that's a good argument for raising money. We have the most modern approach to hospital design. But for the institution, this also created a means to build incrementally. So they could replace that mansion within a year or two. And then they could take years to build up the money to build the rest of the buildings. And in the meantime, Julia Morgan was very good about creating an institution, in this case, that's a building that stood alone as well. As it grew, the hospital would be a cohesive whole, but even in its parts, it was a cohesive whole, so that the institution looked good to people as well. And again, if you have a nice-looking building, you have a precedent, then that also helps you in your quest to raise money. So over time, this building, the whole hospital was constructed, and it was about 6 or 8 buildings. Some of them are gone. Some of them are still there. It's in Oakland. Sometimes, so Julia Morgan was very, very good at designing these incremental designs. And sometimes they were actually pretty revolutionary, as in the case of the Lakeview Annex, the elementary school group in Oakland. Now, this school, because of budgetary constraints, they could only build one structure at a time. So Julia Morgan ended up designing 3 buildings and little annexes that were 1 to 2 stories tall, and they were connected by exterior courtyard or exterior pathways, and then this unifying pergola, covered pergola, which created a play space that was useful on a really hot sunny day and on a rainy day. The kids could still go outside. This, at the time, schools were still were usually monumental, huge single buildings with interior hallways. Even elementary schools, they were usually single buildings, not necessarily really tall. But this notion of multiple low-level buildings with exterior hallways and courtyards, this became the California school style in the post-war period. And this style actually finally broke through the barriers of the California border and disseminated to other parts of the country. So Julia Morgan was very much ahead of her time when she designed this. Again, catering to the needs of her clients, really being able to work with budgets, being innovative and artistic all the while. Okay. Sometimes the significance of Morgan's designs are more subtle. So this building, the Methodist Chinese Mission, now known as Gum Moon, reveals a progressive sensibility of cultural difference, not a radical critique of society or racial inequality, but a progressive sensibility. So the organization dates back to the 1800s, and it was founded to provide shelter, housing, education, Bible study, job opportunities for Chinese women who found themselves in brothels and their children or orphans in Chinatown, San Francisco's Chinatown. The original building on Sacramento Street was destroyed in the earthquake and fires. And in designing the new building, Julia Morgan paid close attention to significant colors and iconography of Chinese culture without exoticizing them in the same way that architects who designed Grant Street, pagodas and things, for instance, did. It's a different project. I mean, the men designing Grant Street were trying to attract white tourists, but still, you have a real nice cultural sensibility here. Morgan chose red brick because red means expansive, blooming, dynamic, enthusiastic, reaching upwards, good luck, celebration, happiness, joy, vitality, and long life. All very positive notions for the women and girls who were inside. And she painted the eaves and brackets and windows in green because green in Chinese culture meant growing, generating, sprouting, striving, refreshing, balancing, calming, healing, self-assurance, foundation, benevolence, health, harmony, sensitivity, and patience versus anger. The keystone is an iris, which also has important symbolic meaning purity, a dancing butterfly, spring or early summer, and probably most important for the mission was to ward off evil spirits. So it's a safe haven. Okay. Morgan added blue in choosing the tiles for the entrance archway. Blue meaning conserving, healing, relaxation, exploration, trust, calmness, and immortality. Both the tiles and the lantern in the entryway were from China. These details might seem insignificant or overblown, but when you compare them to what happened to the Presbyterian Chinese mission, better known as the Donaldina Cameron House, you can see how really progressive Morgan's design was. Yes, it's red brick, but this building was reconstructed from the burned bricks of the original structure that was destroyed in the earthquake and fires. And Donaldina Cameron commented that it worked very efficiently for business, but not so well for a home and a shelter and a safe haven. She noted that the builders who constructed this building never consulted her. So when Donaldina Cameron got to work with Morgan decades later on the construction of the Ming Kwong home in Auckland on the Mills College campus, she was thrilled to be working with the architect who listened to the client and catered to their needs and came up with a design that served the functional and aesthetic needs of the clients. So I want to close by looking at the home of Drs. Elsie Lee Mitchell and Clara Williams. They were both OBGYNs with a private practice in Berkeley, and they're dressed in these uniforms because they both went to Armenia in the wake of Turkish massacres in 1919. So they were quite well-known doctors, actually, at the time. Now, from the exterior, their brown shingle bungalow in the Berkeley Hills isn't particularly striking as any sort of revolutionary architecture, except in the whole pantheon of the Bay tradition style and its general contributions to modern architecture and depleting rainforests, or not rainforests, but redwoods. So it doesn't look remarkably exciting. But then look at the interior, and a number of things stand out. So first at the front, right off the entrance, there's an office complete with a toilet. So the women could have home appointments. They could work at home. But their clients never had to move any further into the house. So there was a real separation of work and home, even as the home was facilitating the development of this professional, which was traditionally dominated by men. There's also a garage, an attached garage. This is very unusual for 1915 because cars' combustible engines were very dangerous. But again, it's a sign of the modernity of these women and their careers because these women had to make house calls. They had to go deliver babies, among other things. So they needed a car, and so they had a garage. So you have these two elements, which are very modern, about women in the professions and facilitating that. You'll also note that the living room and dining room, it's a very open floor plan. Probably one of the most open floor plans in a Julia Morgan house. And again, we think of that as very modern. Typical of a Bay Tradition home, in most of Morgan's homes, but a Bay Tradition home, there are built-in bookshelves, and the interior has redwood. It's all redwood paneling and a redwood ceiling and everything. Now, at the time, on the East Coast, there was this interior decorator who was the most popular, who would have been working with the equivalent of Morgan's general clientele. And she claimed herself to be a feminist and stuff, but she really pushed French Rococo and chintz and flowers as women embracing those sort of feminine stereotypes, embracing them and making them their own. Well, here, the California women, and especially in the Bay Area, they were really embracing a very different aesthetic. So I argue that the Bay Tradition style, with the women adopting it, and remember, Morgan designed hundreds of homes, and women were almost always the client, really, even if it was their husband's money. So California women, they adopted a style, an aesthetic style, that really played more into that whole rugged individualism and being independent in nature. These were all women who loved to go camping, where they could pull up their skirts and put on more comfortable shoes. And then we go downstairs. And this is striking because the upstairs is so open, right? And so public. And the downstairs has the bedrooms and the bathroom. And it's really cut up into spaces, so that's normal for a living area, or bedroom area. But there's some interesting things. You'll note the guest bedrooms, they have basins. Now, maybe this is a sign of belief in sanitation, right? They're doctors, so they want their guests to wash their hands in their rooms. But I think it probably has more to do with privacy. And their guests could clean up and get ready for bed or get dressed or whatever in the privacy of the bedrooms without having to, run along the hallways and let everybody know that they were going to wash their hands or whatnot. They had some privacy. And then there's bedroom number 1 and bedroom number 2, the two master bedrooms. Notably, they share the bathroom, the most intimate space or private space in a house. And so clearly, Elsie Lee Mitchell and Clara Williams were working out how to have modern public lives and grow a clientele, as well as to act upon a lesbian sexuality, a lesbian sexual orientation, in a way that wouldn't be scandalous. It's both modern, facilitating this modern sexuality, and trying to do it in a private way. So we have Morgan accomplishing many, many things in this one house. Okay. Now, the Mitchell house, the Mitchell-Williams house, I'll grant you that it's one of the most extreme examples of gender and feminism and modernity. But Morgan did design hundreds of houses for these women clients. This is one of my favorite sort of procrastination exercises in graduate school, where that turned out to be ever so helpful. So I just took a client, and this is the Oma and Ralph Eltsey, whose house we saw before with the rocks in the front. And I connected Oma Eltsey to 80 other women for whom Julia Morgan designed houses through their affiliations to various women's clubs, which captures for you the breadth of the clientele and their very active lives in progressive causes, which encompassed anything from medicine to higher education to exercise and social activities, juvenile protection, suffrage, and urban development, just among a few of the causes. So imagine Julia Morgan sitting down with all of these clients and making them all feel like the center of her world at that moment, and just like she did for Elizabeth Watt. Each house for all 80 of these people alone, she designed catered to their progressive, if not radical, tendencies. So combined then, Julia Morgan's oeuvre presents a pretty phenomenal landscape of change, and I argue she designed the landscape for modern womanhood, a landscape for the 20th century woman. The end. So, do you want to do questions?
So we're going to have a question and answer session now, and I can bring the mic around for your questions. Is this working? I don't think it's on. Oh well, stand up.
I had a question when you were talking about landscape around some of the Berkeley and Incurables.
Yeah.
Did she have a role in designing the landscape too?
Yeah, she was a full architect. She designed the landscape whenever she could. She liked to have a role in every aspect of design. So that includes the interior, the exterior, and the landscape. And so, yes, she did sometimes, but not always. Not always.
Thanks. That was a great lecture, and I really enjoyed it. I don't think this is working.
No, it is.
Is it working?
It is,
Okay.
yeah.
So a couple of questions. I wanted to get, maybe if you could give us an idea about the size of her practice. And one of the two drawings that you showed for the King's Daughters Home for the Incurables,
Yeah.
they looked really different. I'm
Right.
sure they were different purposes, but they looked really different.
Right.
Like they might have been drawn by different hands. Were those both her? I know one was like a kind of...
Right. I
yeah.
see what you mean. So her practice ranged in size from 4 to, at its height, about 16. So in the 1920s, she had a pretty large practice and averaged more around 6. So it wasn't a gigantic practice. But yeah, it was almost always men and women. More men than women because there were more men available. But always men and women, usually. And she did actually delegate chores. As her practice grew, and she recognized the strengths of her employees, who might be better drafters than her, or better illustrators or whatnot, then she gave them her, supposedly, handkerchief or little postage stamp size kernel of an idea and asked them to build it, draw it out. So 2 different people may very well have drawn those 2 different plans for the King's Daughters home. So yeah, she had, Thaddeus Joy was one of her favorite draftsmen. He was very good at decorative elements. Yeah, so she did delegate, actually.
You had a question here.
Is the Oakland YMCA building still standing? And if so, where is it?
The Oakland YWCA building is still standing. It's at Webster and 16th. The Berkeley YWCA bought it a few years ago, and they promised to maintain it as a YWCA, but it is a charter school now. So whether or not you can go inside, I'm not sure. I haven't visited for a while. But it is still there, definitely.
Oh, okay. I don't know what Julia Morgan's sexual orientation was or whether she was married, had a conventional family life, but I just wondered if she was married, how she balanced her work and family.
So I have a story about that. Julia Morgan was not married. And when she was 70 years old, for the first time, she became a mother because one of her former employees lived in Hawaii and was there when Pearl Harbor was hit, and they had a 12-year-old boy. And so Julia Morgan offered to take this 12-year-old boy under her wing. And, you know, a 12-year-old boy in 1941 was pretty self-sufficient. He was going to school during the day, and then, you know, helicopter parents didn't exist so much. So kids have far more, and I can say this as a parent, and so kids had far more free reign of the streets and stuff. So she didn't have to worry that much. But then summer came, and she got this boy, Barney, into piano lessons, and she tried to put him in a camp, and this camp was out by Davis. And he went, and he was really excited, and it was an overnight camp. And he came back 3 days later because all of the counselors had been called to war. They'd all been conscripted, so they didn't have counselors anymore. And so Julia Morgan was left with this child. Now, at her office, she didn't have much work in 1941. She was doing little remodeling jobs mostly, you know, stuff for William Randolph Hearst. But it was pretty much her alone in the office and not a heavy workload. But she could not balance having a kid and going to work. And so she unloaded Barney after 3 months.
Karen, I have a question. On the Gum Moon building,
Yeah.
you said that the tile in the archway was from China as well as the lighting fixture. What about the keystone with the
I
iris?
don't think the keystone is from China. I think that's a Julia Morgan design.
Was Gladys McBean her main source of terracotta?
She used a variety of people.
Oh,
So, yeah, I can tell you. Okay.
Thanks. How was Morgan's aesthetic influenced by the arts and crafts movement, which seemed to be perhaps more male-dominated?
Well, it's a good question. It's kind of hard to say because when she designed any buildings for herself, they were really not in the arts and crafts style. So, so where her aesthetic preferences lay versus what she was doing for her clients kind of differed. But she really liked the honesty of the arts and crafts style. She liked Dirk Van Erp lamps. She liked she really, really liked the structure acting as decoration. She really liked that aspect of arts and crafts as well. So she never said anything on it, so I can only conjecture. Yeah.
In the King Hospital, you
Yeah.
said that she got away from that brick because of the earthquake in 1906, and then in 1910 she was building this Chinese building in all brick.
Brick
Why?
facade.
Oh,
It's
it's
a
all
wood-
brick facade?
Yeah,
Oh.
but wood frame buildings, which are flexible. And she really got into reinforced concrete as well.
How did Julia Morgan choose the École des Beaux-Arts as opposed to maybe an American school?
There were very few American schools available. She did travel across the country in 1896 on her way to New York, and she looked at Chicago and she looked at MIT, and she could have trained in the offices of her mother's cousin, Pierre Lebrun, who designed the Metropolitan Life Insurance Tower that overlooks Madison Square, and he was a very prominent architect. So she looked into those options, but at the time, the École des Beaux-Arts was the preeminent school that American architects were going to. And she knew, actually, when she left, she knew that the faculty of the École were considering allowing women to take courses, and that there was this promise, but didn't know if it would be upheld, that women would have access to courses and a year later, degree programs. So she went. I mean, I think one thing that's really underestimated about Julia Morgan is how ambitious she was and how competitive she was. And very, very modest and shy in certain social situations, but she had guts. And so she was going to get the best education to have the best career that she possibly could.
Karen, you want to mention that at the École, it took her 2 years to get in, didn't it?
It did. First she spent a year just taking courses, and then she took the exam the first time, and the faculty was nice enough to give women 5 weeks to prepare for their examinations, which for an architecture examination, which included design and an oral math examination and art history and all sorts of stuff, it was a very short amount of time. So she failed, and she failed miserably the first time, and absolutely. She was using the imperial system when she needed to be using the metric system. Total disaster. So she tried to take it again in October and realized it wasn't going well, so she didn't finish. Then she tried again in April 1898, and she thought she did much better. But when she got her scores, she was scored lower on every aspect of the test. And she heard from multiple people that, well, you scored lower. They're not going to let you in because you're a woman. Well, that sparked a flame under her bottom to make her quest to get into the École des Beaux-Arts not just a personal one, but about women. And she vowed that she would take the entrance examinations all 11 times that she had before she turned 30 when you had to leave the École, or until she got in, whichever came first. So it became very much a feminist goal for her to get into the École.
Hi, good morning. I have a question. How did Julia Morgan impact or change the environment?
The natural environment?
I would think natural environment, but socially.
Well, I mean, the natural environment, she was in tune with it. She's of her generation where they tried to use resources, they thought in a balanced way, but there wasn't really a sophisticated science behind their environmentalism. It was growing, but I don't think she had any she had a sentimental attachment to the environment. Architects could probably speak a little bit better on that subject in terms of how efficient her buildings are, and there's some debate about that I'm just not going to get into. But socially is interesting. As I mentioned, in 1940, she was named one of the 10 most influential California women. And when she was awarded the Doctor of Laws degree in 1929, she got a flood of letters saying how important she was to the lives of all these women who she touched. And they didn't necessarily go into architecture. Some went into sciences, some went into home economics, teaching, some went into drafting, some went into art. And other women, again, they had very different careers that didn't have to do with architecture. But Julia Morgan inspired them by giving them a chance, by designing a space for them, by cutting them a deal. She lost so much money on projects for women's institutions. So she was very much understood as an icon. How she affected the architectural profession, I think, is far more debatable. When she died, there was still about 3% of the licensed architects were women. Or 1% and 300 women or something like that, a tiny, tiny fraction. So this illustrious career had not broken down so many barriers that architecture was open to women. And it's a profession that still has a staggeringly low percentage of licensed women. But women train in it 50-50 with men. So, and it's, as I've been working on Julia Morgan over the past dozen years or so, I have found that she has become more and more important to people, and across professions. But even architects, they love her because they understood what she accomplished.
When we were putting the exhibit together downstairs, one of the buildings we visited was 960 Powell, or some address close to that. And that was built as housing for women coming to San Francisco. Do you want to expound on those types of buildings and the whys that she is famous for?
Sure. So Julia Morgan designed over 30 buildings for the YWCA in 17 different locations. And the YWCA, like Gum Moon and like the Presbyterian Mission, it originally had a certain moral reform agenda to provide a safe haven for girls who were coming to the city from their homes for the first time and working. So it had Bible study, and it had appropriate recreation. But the YWCA became this symbol of the modern woman in the early 20th century because the whole Christian agenda of it kind of faded and the jobs orientation of it grew. So there's job training and educational training and physical activities. Women could strip off their clothes and put on comfy things, go swimming, play basketball, and they found housing. And there are times when, again, Julia Morgan's progressive sensibilities come through in these YWCAs. She could think back to Paris when she was relatively poor. She lived a modest life. And she had lived for a year in the American Club, which provided housing and courses and things for women. But after a year, she wanted to be able to entertain. She wanted to be released from the constraints of the rules of the women's residence. And so when she was designing the YWCA residences, she put in kitchens. And she put in kitchens because she understood that the young women who were living in those residences, they didn't just want to live by the rules. They didn't just want to be safe. They wanted to have more independent lives. And so these little kitchenettes that she put into multiple residences, including the Powell Street one, created a place where these women could entertain, which was increasingly important in the 1920s. A youth culture was on the rise by the 1920s, so she had a real sensibility to that.
Hi, 2 questions. First, could you talk a little bit about her family and how she financed all these years at the Beaux-Arts? And the second question is, did she design, it sounded like she may have designed some homes for herself.
Mm-hmm.
And could you just talk a little bit more about them?
Sure.
And are there any left we could see?
The home she lived in on Divisadero Street recently sold, so I know one person in here went to visit it, but that tour is not available now. So Julia Morgan's family was very well off. Her mother did kind of set the tone for ambition and her daughters one going into law, one going into architecture. There were 5 kids. But her father, so her mother came from this family where the grandfather was a self-made millionaire in the cotton trade, and a very prominent Brooklyn family. But Charles Morgan, Julia Morgan's father, he came from a family that had deep, deep political and financial connections, business connections on the East Coast. And his uncle was one of the founders of the GOP and served in Lincoln's administration. So she came from a very prominent East Coast family, and her family had money. Her father had been orphaned, so he didn't come with much money of his own, but her mother inherited some of the wealth of the grandfather, and then the grandmother came to live with the Morgan family. So there was plenty of money for the Morgan family to fund Julia Morgan's education in Paris. And then, yes, Julia Morgan, she lived at the family home until she was 60-ish. She electrified some of the rooms in the back, but she, her sister got married. One brother died quite young. Another brother died in 1918. And the other brother was probably bipolar or manic depressive and not wholly functional in society. So she kind of was the caretaker in the family, and that was a big motivator for staying at home. She also spent no time at home. She worked all the time, so she didn't move out. But in the 1920s, she bought 2 Victorian houses on Divisadero Street and remodeled them and rented out spaces mostly to women often who worked in her office, but not always. And then in the 1930s, she bought herself a little getaway home bungalow in Monterey. She loved the Monterey Peninsula. And she would spend weekends at her little Spanish bungalow in Monterey. She never designed a home from scratch for herself. She remodeled. Okay. Do I see some hands? Oh, right here.
I may have missed it in the earlier discussion, but didn't she also design the buildings and the landscape architecture for the Asilomar Conference Center?
Yeah.
And are there other examples of her work in national parks?
Yes, there's a new brochure actually about Julia Morgan's works in California state parks. So there's Hearst Castle is now a state park, and there's Asilomar. There's the Hearthstone up in the Redwoods, which is a monument to the early environmental movement and women's roles in saving the Redwoods. Let's see, what else is there? The Annenberg Beach House is now a part of a state beach, and for those of you my age, you'll remember Beverly Hills 90210, the beach house. That's the Annenberg house. It was the Marion Davies Beach House. Angel Island Immigration Station, kind of. She was involved with building workers' homes there, but of course most of Angel Island Immigration Station is gone. The buildings that are there, I'm pretty sure they're not hers, but she was involved in that. That's what comes to mind.
What about the hotel in Yosemite National?
No, the Ahwahnee.
The Ahwahnee,
No,
right.
she didn't do the Ahwahnee.
Oh.
No. There we go.
I understand that when Julia Morgan retired, she destroyed many of her drawings, given the ego that architects have, like Arthur Brown, who kept everything. Could you shed some light on the psychology of why that might have happened?
Yeah, it's something of a myth. So Julia Morgan had apparently crammed the basement of the Merchants Exchange building with just reams and bundles of plans. Any duplicates that clients didn't want were burned. But most of her plans have survived, and they're either at Berkeley or they're at San Luis Obispo. Julia Morgan's goddaughter, Lynn McMurray, still has some. And then people who own or occupy Julia Morgan buildings sometimes have them as well. So most plans actually do exist. The ones that have really been lost are the pre-earthquake ones, for the most part.
At a time when there were incredible odds being a woman in a male-dominated profession, and there was a lot of discrimination that was institutionalized, what were the? You mentioned her being a client's architect, but that being said, what were the secrets of her success? I mean, personality, technical skills, just staying the course for practicing 50 years.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
Sure.
And as a person, to recognize even today
Right.
where women have to overcome incredible odds and have to deal with glass ceilings.
Right.
So, comment about all the above.
I finished a 70-page chapter on that. It's a big subject, and it's a complicated one. So among her attributes, she was trained as an engineer. Her engineering training, was obsolete very quickly after she started practicing, but she could speak the language. So that helped her when she was dealing with all these men who didn't believe that women could understand the math and science behind architecture. And it helped her with the builders, all of the carpenters and builders, the laborers, the plumbers, the electricians. They could talk a similar language. She could understand that. So she gained their respect. Without the respect of the people at the building sites, I don't think her career would have been ever so successful. Over the years, I don't want to romanticize Morgan at all. I think she could have been a difficult person to be with at times. And I wouldn't want to emulate her career because there's no personal life in it. But she was a very, very decent person. And she's just consistently thoughtful about how she treated her employees. The women might argue against that. But especially the male employees, she told them to go home when they were sick. She did profit share when she could. She actually did. She fostered their early careers and set them free. So, I mean, there's just hardly any an employee who worked for her who didn't have the utmost respect for her honesty and her decency and her hard work. So as a person, she was just a very decent person. I mean, it's just across the board where this is found. I also think that although she never published any articles, she did lecture once, actually. She was quite savvy early in her career, recognizing that she had a tool that most male architects actually didn't, and that was the Women's Network. The Women's Network had its own series of publications and the women's pages in the newspapers. She was in the papers all the time, not necessarily talking, but she knew the people who worked in the papers, and she didn't say, "Stop writing about me." She let that Women's Network build up her reputation for her as well and spread the word about the quality of her work, the remarkable aspects of her career. So I think she was very savvy about building a public reputation very early on. I could go on, but like I said, it's a big topic. I think we have.
When I think of Julia Morgan's personality, the architect that comes to mind that I think probably has a very opposite personality is Frank Lloyd Wright. Do you know if they ever crossed paths at all?
I don't think they did, and I think she had no respect for him. She might have actually liked some of his work, but she found him just so brazenly obnoxious in his public persona. Yeah.
I believe Julia Morgan worked for Hearst for about 20, 30 years. Can you speak a little bit about their relationship? Because Hearst had such a strong personality, and she was kind of a loner, but she worked on site. And how did they interact? Or did they have an affair, or was there talk about this?
They had much more of a sibling-like relationship, I would say. He was much more like a big brother. But to me, they were actually like two peas in a pod. They were both complete workaholics. And they both loved architecture. They were just on call, answering those telegrams just the second they arrived. So they were very similar personalities that expressed themselves in almost opposite ways. But they got on famously. And so well that Julia Morgan would critique him, and she used his own public arguments for why something should be to get him, like he would say, buy American, and he would want to hire some Italian sculptor to do something for Hearst Castle. And she would say, well, we've got this guy in San Francisco. Why don't we abide by your slogan of buy American and hire him? So there was a real confidence in the relationship, and she would call his bluff. And, yeah, she nagged him, and, yeah.
I was just wondering about, the title was mentioned her genius, and I've heard a lot of things that she was very extraordinary, but I didn't hear so much that made me think genius. What part would that encompass?
So I didn't come up with the title. I don't know if you. I think that if we take the person and career and all the complexities as a whole, that there's an implicit genius in being able to make that happen. But yeah, I mean, she wasn't necessarily the most extraordinary draftsman. I mean, it's true. But I think her genius, really, to me, could be in this sensitivity to everyday life, which makes so many of her buildings function well today. Because she worked from the inside out, she worked with the client, and again, it's this everydayness to her architecture rather than, the architect as omniscient artist that's going to design the most fabulous place that doesn't function, like she and Bernard Maybeck would argue that Frank Lloyd Wright did. So I think it really could be in the everyday.
Actually, I'd like to give an example for everybody for that, being practical and designing for the everyday. One of her buildings is at Page and Laguna. It's the San Francisco Zen Center now. The house or the building was built for the Emmanuel Sisterhood as a refuge, like the Jewish equivalent of a YW residence. But now the Zen Center is there, and they bought it in 1969, and they have made only one structural change, and that is to make a window a doorway so that people today can go from that building into the building next door, which the Zen Center owns. And I know the people that are in that building now love the building, and it works so perfectly for them. And it's still a beautiful building.
Well, I think as an architect, the fact that so many of her buildings function so well and are still used, and that one person in their lifetime could do 700 projects and actually, get them built and maintain the level of detail, that's genius. Anybody else want to comment?
Thanks. I just wanted to say, it feels like we're getting to the end of the lecture. Before we close, do you mind just going around that slide and identifying the buildings for us that you show?
So that's the Oakland YWCA. In the top middle is the Riverside YWCA. Top right is the Hollywood Studio Club.
And could you say if they're still existing, if it's not obvious?
Let's see. Yes, all three of those still exist on top. Let's see. This one is going to escape me right now. I want to say it's the Awani Sanitarium, maybe. She did a bunch of sanitariums, but I could be wrong. Asilomar exists. Also Asilomar in the center small one. The center right small one, that's the Pasadena YWCA, which is in danger, but the city of Pasadena is purchasing it. I think it finally came through. Fresno, I'm not sure if this is the one that was demolished or changed beyond recognition. Honolulu YWCA is still there. Totally forget. Asilomar, and this is the San Pedro YWCA, which was built as a hostess house during World War I. So very, very, very tiny budget for the Seagulls, the girls who were going from base to base following the military. Yeah. Can I just mention one last thing?
One of the interesting things is that early on in her career, her technical competence was early recognized, and she was asked to redo all of the structural work at the Fairmont Hotel,
right,
which was about to open when the earthquake happened,
right,
and the entire center of the interior was burned.
Right.
And she had this very difficult job of having an existing building and then having to completely redo the structure of that. Another thing that is amazing about her is that she was very courageous. That is, Frederick Myers, who did the Belgravia, where we have our apartment, didn't want to leave California, and so didn't go to MIT or to the Beaux-Arts, and apprenticed himself to practicing architect, and eventually got his license that way. But she wanted to do it the right way,
right,
and she did.
Right, right. Yeah, she beat the odds. I just wanted to mention before I forget that I am paragraphs away from finishing that manuscript. But in the meantime, you can read my latest article in a beautifully designed publication, the latest issue of California History, which you can get around the corner at the California Historical Society.
Thank you so much, Karen. And thank you for attending our public lecture. Do stop by at our exhibit downstairs. One of the buildings Julia Morgan worked on is the Hearst building on our block, right at the corner of Market and 3rd, where it meets Kearney. The lobby, you can walk in the lobby and see the facade, the entry facade. It's exquisite. So thank you again. Have a good day.